Okay, hello everyone. This is Marx Philosophy Session 5, um, led by Professor Ray Brassier, and we're gonna start the lesson right now.
Okay, thanks. So I've just sent the handout to everyone, so I hope, I think, let me know if you haven't received it. So today we're going to begin looking at volume 1 of Capital, especially the first chapter of volume 1 of Capital. And also because that we're only now, I've decided to kind of make an adjustment to the syllabus because we're now in week 5. So I'd like to do, I want to spend at least 2 weeks on Capital, but mainly just focusing on volume 1, which means, so if we do that, that would only give us, 2 sessions, 2 concluding sessions. So I'd like to basically do volume 1 of Capital this week and next week. So that will be 5 and 6, and then that leaves us 2 weeks in which I'd like to do Lukács and Althusser. Lukács in weeks 7 and Althusser in week 8. But if it's possible that we'll see how it goes. But I'm hoping to be able to do both of those. But I've eliminated the original kind of reading for week 8 because I just don't think we're going to get to it, basically. Yeah, I hope that will work out. So okay, today we're doing let's start. Let's start going through the handout. So today we're going to look at Marx's analysis of the commodity form, or the relationship between commodities, value, and money. Now, last week we looked at the Grundriss, and we discussed the distinction which seems to be fundamental for Marx's, the method of the critique of political economy, which is a distinction between the concrete in thought and the concrete in reality, the concrete in actuality. And what I suggested there was that the starting point for Marx's critique of political economy, and in other words, his critical analysis of capitalist society, are not any kind of, it's not a set of empirical data, nor a set of metaphysical assumptions, but rather the categories of political economy understood as standing in a symptomatic relationship to the reality, to the capitalist reality that they are both describing, but also by which they are conditioned, without understanding the nature of their conditioning by it. So what Marx is, what I suggested was that Marx's method is trying to immanently generate the categories that will, that allow him to analyze capitalism. So unlike traditional political economists, he's not taking these categories for granted, he's generating them through his analysis. And the category of commodity, just like the category of value and the category of money, is generated through Marx's analysis. Now, in relationship, if you remember, when we discussed, the traditional categories of political economy are, production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. And one way of understanding what's going on is that, in a way, Marx is going to show through his analysis that, in a way, that all these categories are interdependent. You know, you can't kind of understand any of them in complete abstraction from the others. However, the category, or the categorical determination which is most important for his analysis is the category of exchange, because, you know, Marx's thesis, as you know, explained by you know, the so-called value theory analysis, which is, you know, exemplified by Michael Heinrich's little book, is that basically the relationship between production, distribution, and consumption is mediated by the exchange relation. What is, you know, the unit of exchange is the commodity. You know, what is exchanged is the commodity. What is produced is the commodity, and what is circulated and consumed is the commodity. So in a way, by beginning his analysis with an analysis of the commodity form, in a way, all the relationship between production, distribution, and exchange, production, distribution, exchange, and consumption, is concentrated in the analysis of the commodity form. I mean, it will subsequently be unpacked in volumes 2 and 3, but you know, the reason why the analysis begins with the commodity form is because the commodities are both the fundamental units of production, but also of exchange. A commodity is something that is produced in order to be exchanged. Therefore, its exchangeability is the precondition of its production. This is very important. So now Marx is, so the first fundamental distinction Marx, you know, makes, and which I'm sure you all know, is the distinction between use value and exchange value. But it's important to understand this properly. The use value of a commodity is simply what it can be used for. You know, the purposes or the functions that it satisfies. And Marx wants to insist that the exchange value of the commodity can never be read off its use value. So in other words, that what he calls the exchangeability of a commodity has nothing to do with its usefulness. Okay, that's the first claim. So in number 1, we see Marx writes, the utility of a thing makes it a use value. But this utility is not a thing of air. Being limited by the physical properties of the commodity, it has no existence apart from that commodity. A commodity such as iron, corn, or a diamond is therefore, so far as it is a material thing, a use value, something useful. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. This is important because, although labor generates use, but is not the immanent measure of the usefulness of a commodity, because things, things can be useful: water, soil, air, minerals, materials. All of these things can be useful, but none of them are, products of labor. I mean, they have to be, extracting their use requires their transformation by labor, but they are not themselves, commodities. They're not themselves produced by labor. The usefulness of a commodity is a physical, kind of a physical property. This physical property is, now by physical here, he doesn't simply mean it's a natural property. And I think it's important to understand that what something is used for isn't necessarily predetermined by its physical characteristics or properties. Thinks of all the different ways in which human beings can use physical objects. So even though use value is tied to the physical structure of an object, its use value is not predetermined by its physical attributes. Okay, so this is why there is no, even the usefulness of an object can't itself be abstracted from the social context or the social relations in which human beings use objects to satisfy certain functions or purposes, which are, socially generated. The point being that the contrast between use and exchange is not simply a contrast between a kind of an intrinsic property of physical objects and an extrinsic kind of relative property, because even the usefulness of objects, although it's tied to their physical characteristics, is not determined by them. It's also socially mediated. So the claim is that the exchangeability of a useful object is something that has to be understood as, in a way, kind of a second order abstraction, or it's something that is socially mediated, but in a way which has to be understood independently of the way in which usefulness or function is socially mediated. And this is why, Marx says that, the exchange value of a commodity is a very peculiar quality or characteristic tied to what he calls its spectral objectivity. We'll get to that. Okay. Now I'm not going to read the entirety of quote 2, but I'll just read the passages in bold. First, the valid exchange values of a given commodity express something equal. And secondly, exchange value generally is only the mode of expression, the phenomenal form of something contained in it, yet distinguishable from it. Let us take two commodities, corn and iron. The proportions in which they are exchangeable, whatever these proportions may be, can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. For example, 1/4 of corn equals X hundredweight of iron. What does this equation tell us? It tells us that in two different things, in 1/4 of corn and X hundredweight of iron, there exists in equal quantities something common to both. The two things must therefore be equal to a third, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. Each of them, so far as it is exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third. But this common something cannot be either a geometrical, a chemical, or any other natural property of commodities. Such properties claim our attention only insofar as they affect the utility of those commodities or make them use values. But the exchange of commodities is evidently an act characterized by a total abstraction from use value. As use values, commodities are above all of different qualities, but as exchange values, they are merely different quantities and consequently do not contain an atom of use value. So there's two things going on here. First is, the Marx's claim that not one atom of use values enters into the exchange value of a commodity. So that if two commodities are exchangeable, they have something in common, and that something is value. Okay, they're exchanged on the basis of a value which they have in common. but that value has nothing to do with their usefulness. And therefore, the measure of value, the measure of this value understood as exchangeability, cannot be determined by any use that these commodities might have. So Marx's question is, what is it that makes, what is the basis of exchange? What is it that makes things, what is this third thing, this thing that commodities have in common? Now, those of you who, I guess, who know Marx or are familiar with Marx will know that, well, the obvious answer is that Marx is going to say that it's labor. That labor is the substance of exchange value. Commodities are products of labor, and the value of a commodity is determined by the labor that went into its manufacturing. And this is, the so-called labor theory of value, which is often attributed to Marx. But Michael Heinrich, whose reading I'm following here, thinks that this is a mistake. It's a mistake. Now, to understand why it's a mistake is to understand first the significance of abstract labor in Marx's analysis, because if commodities are the products of labor, the only labor can only be used to determine the substance of exchange value by abstracting from its concrete characteristics or the qualities of labor. So the contrast is this: is that concrete labor, okay, produces use values. Okay, if you're so consider all the different types of labor. You can there's a blacksmith, a shoemaker, a weaver, etc. These are all forms of concrete labor, and they are qualitatively distinct. The skills employed in these forms of labor are distinct. The materials processed in these forms of labor are distinct, and the products of labor are distinct and serve different purposes. The labor that forms the substance of exchange value is abstract labor. In other words, it's a labor whose concrete characteristics are disregarded. So now we come to, so I'll read this is number 3 on the handout. Marx writes, if we leave out of consideration the use value of commodities, they have only one common property left, that of being products of labor. But even the product of labor itself has undergone a change in our hands. If we make abstraction from its use value, we make abstraction at the same time from the material elements and shapes that make the product a use value. We see in it no longer a table, a house, yarn, or any other useful thing. Its existence as a material thing is put out of sight. And neither can it any longer be regarded as the product of the labor of the joiner, the mason, the spinner, or any other definite kind of productive labor. Along with the useful qualities of the products themselves, we put out of sight both the useful character of the various kinds of labor embodied in them and the concrete forms of that labor. There is nothing left but what is common to them all. All are reduced to one and the same sort of labor, human labor in the abstract. Let's now consider the residue of each of these products. It consists of the same unsubstantial reality in each, a mere congelation of homogeneous human labor, of labor power expended without regard to the mode of its expenditure. All that these things now tell us is that human labor power has been expended in their production, that human labor is embodied in them. When looked at as crystals of this social substance common to them all, they are values. Therefore, the common substance that manifests itself in the exchange value of commodities, whenever they are exchanged, is their value. So the substance, okay, of value for Marx will be socially necessary abstract labor time. So that means that in order to commensurate objects with, in order to measure the value of commodities that have different useful characteristics, we must, abstract from the concrete forms of labors that endow them with concrete forms of use value to arrive at abstract labor. But abstract labor itself is measured in terms of the time it takes. Okay, so this is why, in a way, if abstract labor is a substance of exchange value, socially necessary labor time is the substance of abstract labor, or is the unit for measuring the quantity of abstract labor that constitutes the substance of value. So Marx writes, some people might think that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor spent on it, the more idle and unskillful the laborer, the more valuable would be his commodity would be, because more time would be required in its production. The labor, however, that forms a substance of value is homogeneous human labor, expenditure of one uniform labor power. The total labor power of society, which is embodied in the sum total of the values of all commodities produced by that society, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power, composed though it be of innumerable individual units. Each of these units is the same as any other, so far as it has the character of the average labor power of society and takes effect as such. That is, so far as it requires for producing a commodity no more time than is needed on average, or no more than is socially necessary. The labor time socially necessary is that required to produce an article under the normal conditions of production and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. So in a way, just as exchange involves an abstraction from use, exchange value involves a complete abstraction from use value, abstract labor, which is the substance of exchange value, involves a complete abstraction from the concrete labor that generates particular uses. And so the labor time, the time that abstract labor takes, first of all, it can't be measured by clock time. Okay, a clock can measure a concrete act of production. Okay, only concrete labor can be measured in terms of clock time, but no clock can measure abstract labor time because it's the socially average time required with an average degree of skill and intensity, which is why abstract labor involves a reduction. You abstract from the particular concrete skills that distinguish concrete labors from each other, and you reduce all skill to a kind of generic you know, generic unskilled labor. So Marx writes in number 5, a commodity may be the product of the most skilled labor, but its value, by equating it to the product of simple unskilled labor, represents a definite quantity of the latter labor alone. The different proportions in which different sorts of labor are reduced to unskilled labor as their standard are established by a social process that goes on behind the backs of the producers and consequently appears to be fixed by custom. For simplicity's sake, we shall henceforth account every kind of labor to be unskilled, simple labor. And by this, we do no more than save ourselves the trouble of making the reduction. So what Heinrich points out is that in a way, the abstraction from concrete labor, okay, which is in a way, the presupposition of the exchangeability of commodities, insofar as this abstract labor, you know, constitutes is the substance of the value of the commodity. This abstraction takes place behind the backs of the producers of commodities. And it's socially validated, says Marx. It's socially validated because society, understood as the totality of relations between you know, individuals or members of the society, carries out this, in a way, carries out the abstraction. Okay, the abstraction from the concrete to the abstract is carried out behind the backs of individual producers and consumers of commodities, and is ensured by society, you know, society understood as the totality of relations between, you know, producers and consumers of commodities. It's also important because the social validation is, in order to determine to what extent one can abstract from any particular kind of skilled labor to arrive at abstract labor, a whole set of you know, societal assumptions and conditions come into play. So in other words, the point is that the distinction between skilled and unskilled labor, which Marx is invoking here, is itself variable, historically and socially variable. Okay? He's not pointing to any kind of definite, you know, there is no absolute measure of the difference between skilled and unskilled labor. It is socially variable, which is why it is the reduction of concrete labor to abstract labor is something that is socially validated. But this validation is always historically specific. And different societies will have different ways of you know, adjudicating the difference between abstract and concrete labor, or skilled and unskilled labor. Now, the time, okay, the time is the measure of abstract labor, but here again, this is not a concrete, any kind of determinate time. It's not the time that is measured by any clock. Once again, it's socially necessary abstract labor time. It's time measured in terms of some socially validated average, and this is why socially necessary labor time is variable. It depends on certain conditions. So Marx writes in number 6, as values, all commodities are only definite masses of congealed labor time. The value of a commodity would therefore remain constant if the labor time required for its production also remained constant. But the latter changes with every variation in the productiveness of labor. And this productiveness is determined by various circumstances, amongst others, by the average amount of skill of the workman, the state of science, the degree of its practical application, the social organization of production, the extent and capabilities of the means of production, and by physical conditions. In general, the greater the productiveness of labor, the less is the labor time required for the production of an article. The less is the amount of labor crystallized in that article, and the less is its value, and vice versa. The less the productiveness of labor, the greater the labor time required for the production of an article, and the greater is its value. The value of a commodity therefore varies directly as the quantity and inversely as the productiveness of the labor incorporated in it. Okay, before I go on, I see that there's a comment here from Peter. I'll read this comment.
Yeah, right. That you'd actually just clarified that.
Okay.
It's not exchange value. I was just trying to think how does it happen? How does this abstraction happen? It can't just come from the concrete and then become abstract. There has to be it has to be in relation to something else. I thought it must be exchange value, but no, it's science. It's the skill of the workers. It's socially produced, like you're saying. There's actually, I was reading something only recently that reminds me of this. It was called Red Plenty, and in the book there's sort of like an ongoing joke, like I think that they've sort of misinterpreted the labor theory of value, maybe, and so they're producing like unnecessarily large chairs and chandeliers and everything because they think that like, well, presumably maybe because a lot of labor time has gone into it, it must be sort of valuable. Do you know what I mean? So the metrics they've given to the managers to sort of measure everything are just sort of, I don't know, maybe they don't take into account this sort of concrete abstract difference between concrete labor and abstract labor.
Yeah, the key thing, I mean, I think the key to understanding Marx is his theory of real abstraction. So what he's talking about, he said, capitalism is a system of real abstractions, okay? Now, so this is something I began, we kind of discussed a little bit last week. What is value and money are real abstractions. Now, what does that mean? What is the contrast between a real abstraction and, let's say, the opposite would be an ideal abstraction? Well, an ideal abstraction, say redness or justice or goodness or beauty, okay? These are, ideal abstractions. These are abstractions generated through intellection, through an intellectual operation, okay? If you have a bunch of, if you see, we perceive many, many red things, okay, but we abstract redness as the common property, the universal attribute, which is common to all particular red things. But redness as such, doesn't exist in any particular red thing. It's distinct, and therefore it's, whereas red things are particulars that exist in space and time. Redness as such, as a universal, is an abstract entity that has no concrete spatial temporal existence. Okay, and you can say the same thing for justice, goodness, okay. Now, Marx's proposal is that a real abstraction is something that is it's an abstraction that is generated through practice, through social practice, and not through intellection. It's abstract because you cannot point to it, okay? A concrete entity is a spatial temporal particular which can be pointed to, okay? I can point to, this red thing, or that red thing, or this other red thing. I can point to this good person, or this good act, or this other good thing, but I can't point to redness as such, or goodness as such, okay? They're universals, they're abstract entities. Now, Marx's claim is that value and money and labor under capitalism are real abstractions because they are not spatial temporal particulars, you cannot point to them, okay? They are not concrete entities. But he says, nevertheless, they are not transcendent entities existing beyond space and time. They have this they are entities which are generated through human practices, but whose existence is spatial temporally distributed. Okay, so if you think about value for Marx, value is something that turns out to kind of coordinate all of the human existence under capitalism, but it's not something that you can point to. And money, the money form, which is the measure of value, is also a real abstraction, because it's what allows you, ultimately all value is measured in terms of money, but money is also something that is abstract, that it's not, it's something that is instituted in human social practice, but it's not a spatial temporal particular. So as I remember, the pieces of paper or metal that you carry around in your pockets and your wallets are not money. Okay, they are merely tokens. Okay, they're emblems or they're placeholders for money, but money is not something that you can hold in your hand. Okay, and that's what Marx means by a real abstraction. But it turns out in Marx's account that labor is also a real abstraction, because the labor that constitutes the substance of value that makes all things exchangeable is itself an abstraction. It's abstract labor, and it's abstract labor which is ultimately which is commodifiable. Okay, it's abstract labor. In order for the reduction of concrete labor to abstract labor to be possible, labor must be something that can be exchanged, which is to say that the labor power of the worker is itself something that has a value in a way, and ultimately something that whose value is measured by money. So Michael Heinrich points out, says it's a mistake to think that Marx espouses a labor theory of value. He says, as people like Mill and the classical economists did, Marx espouses a monetary theory of value, because it turns out that the abstract labor that constitutes the substance of value, of exchange value, is itself a commodity. Okay, abstract labor is itself a commodity, and it is itself something that can be bought and sold, and therefore that is subsumed by, by value, by exchange, and ultimately measured in terms of money. So one consequence of this analysis is that it's a mistake to think that that labor is some kind of, to think that labor is a kind of, as a concrete material reality that generates the substance of value, because the conditions under which labor generates the substance of value is a condition under which labor has already been abstracted from its concrete instances and reduced to you know, a kind of a socially validated you know, abstract form, and something who's, you know, that's measured in terms of you know, abstract time, socially necessary abstract labor time. On this account, this is why when, you know, when Marx says that not one parcel of use, there's nothing concrete, no concrete physical characteristics of objects or of human physical activity enter into the substance of value. He means it. He means that value is a real abstraction, and it's a real abstraction that mediates all social existence under capital, which means that even the labor, okay, that counts, the labor that is validated as valuable, as value generating, is itself abstract labor, okay, and never concrete labor. Which is why the attempt to kind of, you know, an example you gave from this book, from the Red Plenty book, there's no way of tying value, or there's no way of coordinating exchange value to any form, any manifestation of concrete labor. Okay? There's a complete disconnection. And in fact, I think for Marx, you know, because, you know, everything we do, because of, you know, Marx emphasizes a social totality, you know, there's the social totality is always already what mediates relationships between, you know, individual social agents and individual social roles. That means that, you know, nothing, you know, you can't point to some kind of dimension of human practical activity or of human, you know, labor or productivity that somehow subsists in itself independently of its mediation by value under the capital relation. And this is, so this reading has kind of drastic consequences, because it will see the fundamental distinction is between use creating labor and value generating labor, but use creating labor is not some kind of ahistorical abstract, you know, or Marx says that the attempt to posit you know, use creating useful labor as some kind of you know, ahistorical invariant would itself be, you know, an abstraction, a bad kind of metaphysical abstraction. The relationship between everything, the ways in which we create useful objects, you know, under capitalism is itself mediated by the value form, and we don't have access to a sphere of use in itself. Okay, there is no sphere of use in itself or of labor in itself existing independently of historically specific social forms. And as far as our current understanding of you know, our own existence and the social forms that you know, led up to our social existence, you can't abstract, you can't understand the modalities of useful labor independently of the way in which use is currently mediated by value. Now, I hope that this, I mean, I hope that this will become a bit clearer once we, you know, move on. Well, actually, it ties on. Commodity production presupposes social exchange. This is point number 7. Marx writes, anything can be a use value without having value. This is the case whenever its utility to man is not due to labor, such are air, virgin soil, natural metals, etc. A thing can be useful in the product of human labor without being a commodity. Whoever directly satisfies his wants with the produce of his own labor creates, indeed, use values, but not commodities. In order to produce the latter, i.e. commodities, he must not only produce use value, but use values for others, i.e. social use values. So the point, okay, Marx wants to point, there's a fundamental difference between exchanging on the basis of use, exchanging on the basis of usefulness, and exchanging on the basis of what Marx calls value or exchange value. A commodity is produced in order to be exchanged, and the conditions of its production are conditioned by the exchange relation. Which is to say that and because the exchange relation is something that is instituted at the level of the social totality, that means that whatever use values commodities have is inseparable, or rather, it's not inseparable, but is necessarily somehow connected or somehow determined by their exchange value, their exchangeability. So the difference between, there have been commodities, the commodity form is anticipated by pre-capitalist societies, and obviously all, pre-capitalist societies involve all sorts of exchange, but exchange was never an end in itself, basically. Okay, things are exchanged on the basis of use, and there was a kind of a social society has a certain structure which determines what uses things will have. So, for instance, the medieval peasant produces corn for the feudal lord. He produces two types of corn, for the lord and the one type for the lord, another type for the parson. And the lord and the parson have different social roles within a feudal society. But in a society which is entirely organized around commodity exchange, that means everything, no aspect of use or no dimension, no feature of use can be entirely abstracted from the sphere of exchange. And this is why, and remember here Marx's comment that the anatomy of man is the key to the anatomy of the ape. Marx insists, historical materialism means that when Marx talks about the relationship between capitalist society and feudal society, he doesn't view feudal society as anticipating. He doesn't think that capitalist society simply evolved naturally out of feudal society. He thinks that the features of feudal society that are intelligible to us, and that help us understand capitalist society, can only be, understood if we have a proper analysis of the structure of capitalist society. And since, according to him, everything is coordinated by the primacy of exchange, that means that it's the structure of capitalist commodity exchange that makes feudal, the forms of exchange that were not yet wholly commodified in feudalism, historically intelligible to us. Again, all this to say that this is why Marx is offering a kind of a synchronic structural analysis He's not. He's treating the capitalist totality as a kind of as a totally integrated structure whose moments are all interdependent. And he's not trying to explain the historical genesis of capitalism, because, you know, there's no, you know, he thinks that, in other words, he emphasizes the historical specificity of the capitalist totality, but he doesn't think it evolves kind of naturally out of these pre-capitalist social formations. And I think it's always important to remember this when, whenever Marx talks about history, or when we're talking about Marx's historical materialism, it's only by understanding. It's only by going through the critique of political economy, by understanding how the categories of analysis are determined by the capitalist social relations that
Hello, Ray. Can you hear us?
Hey, Ray, we can't hear you.
Can you hear us?
Hello?
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 Hi, Ray. Yeah, you dropped off there for a minute.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, there was a power cut. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, there was a power cut. It happens here sometimes. But anyway, I guess it's good because it stopped me from droning on. Okay, let's get back to let's get back to the handout. Commodity production presupposes social exchange. So Marx's claim is that all social relations under capital are mediated by exchange value. That's the basic claim. So that you can't understand any feature of capitalist society without understanding the exchange relation, which is fundamental, around which everything else kind of orbits. And his claim, and this exchange relation, which is absolutely kind of central to capitalism, can't be read off pre-capitalist forms of exchange. Okay, you just it's only by understanding the capitalist exchange relation that we can see we can understand exchange in pre-capitalist social formation. So this is, the anatomy of man is the key to the anatomy of the ape. Okay. So let's move on to number 8. So the second, the distinction between useful labor and valuable labor. I think this is also the key to understanding Marx. Marx writes, in the use value of each commodity, there is contained useful labor, i.e. productive activity of a definite kind, exercised with a definite aim. Use values cannot confront each other as commodities unless the useful labor embodied in them is qualitatively different in each of them. In a community, the produce of which in general takes the form of commodities, i.e. in a community of commodity producers, this qualitative difference between the useful forms of labor that are carried on independently by individual producers, each on their own account, develops into a complex system, a social division of labor. So far, therefore, as labor is a creator of use value, is useful labor, it's a necessary condition independent of all forms of society for the existence of the human race. It is an eternal nature-imposed necessity without which there can be no material exchanges between man and nature and therefore no life. So this is often taken to be, so when Marx is famous for emphasizing the primacy of labor, but the distinction between useful labor and valuable labor is absolutely crucial. Marx is saying, he's not, we know that the valuable labor or value generating labor is abstract labor. It's socially validated abstract labor. It's not any kind of concrete labor. But remember that for Marx, every variety of concrete labor is social, presupposes a kind of a mode of production and relations of production. So Marx says obviously human beings have to produce and reproduce the material conditions of their existence, and labor is necessary. This is useful labor. But the use values, the use values created by useful labor can never be abstracted from a historically specific mode of production and historically specific relations of production, which is why, although labor, as he puts it, is a necessary condition independent of all forms of society. It's the invariant, it's a common thread running through human history. The forms, the varieties of use, created by labor are not historically immutable. It's one thing to say that, useful labor is a necessary condition independent of all historically specific societies, but that's not to say that that there's a repertory of use values which are in themselves necessary and necessary conditions, and independent of all historically specific societies. So I think this is why, although Marx recognizes, the necessity of labor, he thinks, he's not, he says, what kinds of labor, the use values created by labor are always historically specific, are always going to, presuppose, historically specific social formations. And this, I think, if you understand, this is why he's not simply saying, that there are certain things, that there are basic necessities, which condition all human existence, not even, food, clothing, and shelter, This is why Marx is not a kind of, he's not saying human beings will always have these elementary physiological needs that they will have to satisfy. If he believed that, he couldn't be a communist, because it's precisely, he thinks that the transformation in the relationship between means and ends under capitalism, because of the socialization of labor under capital, allows for the satisfaction of all material human needs. We can produce, we have a kind of a regime of production which allows us to satisfy, to eliminate want and scarcity for the first time in human history. And the point is to, he thinks, is to kind of transform social relations and abolish the subordination of labor to value, so as to create, currently unenvisageable, modalities of use. Okay, the point is that communism won't be it's not the return to the satisfaction of perennial human needs. It's the ushering in of a dimension in which a dimension for the satisfaction of needs that are historically unprecedented and currently unenvisageable from the vantage point of the domination of the value form. Okay, yes, there is a distinction between useful and valuable labor, use-creating labor and value-creating labor, but there is no eternal domain of use to which labor must always be subordinated. Because if Marx believed that, then he would be, a primitive communist, which I think clearly he is not. Okay, and finally, as we, abstract labor is a social form, not a physiological reality. It's a mistake, abstract labor, again, it's a mistake. The form abstraction involved in the reduction of concrete to abstract labor, abstract labor is not to be understood as some kind of, once again, kind of generic human capacity, okay? A kind of, a historically invariant, capacity of the human species. It's not. It is something that is, it's a social form, and it's something that is conditioned by value and by the exchange abstraction. It's important not to substantialize, abstract labor, which would be they are, tending upon the temptation to substantialize concrete labor. Okay, so now we're going to move on because, okay, it's going to try to move a little bit faster now. I wanted to discuss, okay, so first, value is a function of the social relation between commodities. And this Marx writes in number 11 on the handout, the value of commodities is the very opposite of the coarse materiality of their substance. Not an atom of matter enters into its composition. Turn and examine a single commodity by itself, as we will, yet insofar as it remains an object of value, it seems impossible to grasp it. If, however, we bear in mind that the value of commodities has a purely social reality, and that they acquire this reality only insofar as they are expressions or embodiments of one identical social substance, viz. Human labor, it follows as a matter of course that value can only manifest itself in the social relation of commodity to commodity. Okay, so value is a social relation, but it's a social relation between commodities. So now we have to understand the nature of this social relation between commodities. So the first distinction that Marx will make is between what he calls relative value and equivalent value. Okay, he says the value of any given commodity can only be measured in terms of another commodity. So the famous example he gives in Capital is, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, okay? And in this account, the 20 yards of linen have a relative value, and the coat has an equivalent value. The value of the linen is expressed in the value of the coat. Okay, so we say, as Marx himself writes in number 13, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat. Now, there's a reversibility between this, the relation of relative value and equivalent value. But first of all, before we examine this reversibility, we must understand what is peculiar to the equivalent value. So in quotation number 12 on the handout, Marx writes, the relative form of the value of the linen presupposes therefore the presence of some other commodity, here the coat, under the form of an equivalent. On the other hand, the commodity that figures as the equivalent cannot at the same time assume the relative form. So there's an asymmetry. The value of a commodity can only be expressed in another distinct commodity. In a way, the commodity that assumes the expressive role, okay, the commodity that figures as the equivalent value of some other commodity, can't itself express its own value. Okay, its value can only be expressed in another, in a third commodity. Now, the question then is, what is the the characteristic of the equivalent value, or what characteristic of a commodity allows it to be the bearer of the equivalent value for another commodity? Now here, okay, I'm going to look at number 15 on the handout, okay? Marx writes, when occupying the position of equivalent in the equation of value, the coat ranks qualitatively as the equal of the linen, as something of the same kind because it is value. In this position, it is a thing in which we see nothing but value, or whose palpable bodily form represents value. Yet the coat itself, the body of the commodity coat, is a mere use value. A coat as such no more tells us it is value than does the first piece of linen we take hold of. This shows that when placed in value relation to the linen, the coat signifies more than when out of that relation. Just as many a man strutting about in a gorgeous uniform counts for more than when in mufti. Now, the point he's making here is that in order for the coat to express the value of the linen, in order for it to be, the equivalent value of the linen, in a way, we also abstract from its use value. Okay, in other words, the physical, the useful properties of the coat, the attributes that make it a useful thing, are irrelevant to its expressive role vis-a-vis the value of the other commodity, the linen. And this is where Marx begins to talk about the value form, the form of value. Here, the coat is the form of value for the linen, and insofar as it can, express the form of value of the linen, we we disregard all its, material or kind of, physical attributes. Marx writes, by means, therefore, of the value relation expressed in our equation, the bodily form of commodity B, i.e. the coat, becomes the value form of commodity A, i.e. the linen, or the body of commodity B acts as a mirror to the value of commodity A. By putting itself in relation with commodity B as value in its own person, as the matter of which human labor is made up, the commodity A, remember here this was the linen, converts the value in use B, i.e. the coat, into the substance in which to express its A's own value. The value of A thus expressed in the use value B has taken the form of relative value. Okay, but Marx continues, this is number 17. The value form must therefore not only express value generally, but also value in a definite quantity. Therefore, in the value relation of commodity A to commodity B, of the linen to the coat, not only is the latter's value in general made the equal in quality of the linen, but a definite quantity of coat is made the equivalent of a definite quantity of linen. One coat, is made the equivalent of 20 yards of linen. So what Marx is pointing out here is that what's happening here is that in the value form, value can only be determined by abstracting from the qualities that express the usefulness of a commodity. So, in other words, that the substance of value, which is common to two commodities A and B, linen and coat, has a merely quantitative value as opposed to a qualitative value. So value is quantitative and homogeneous, okay, because it must be the common element on, guaranteeing the exchangeability of different commodities. So therefore, and this common element must be homogeneous. It must be, but its homogeneity can't be understood in terms of any qualitative commonality, any qualitative resemblance between these different commodities. So therefore, it can only be quantitatively measured. Okay, so therefore, the value relation between commodities is ultimately assumes a quantitative form. It's a magnitude. This is why we have to talk about magnitudes of value, and not not any qualities. Value is without quality. So here then Marx, and I'm just kind of summarizing very briefly now. I'm moving very fast, but so he distinguishes between the equivalent form of value, as when we say that the coat is the equivalent for 20 yards of linen. Okay, and then he distinguishes between what he calls the total form of value, because if you think, when you say the equivalent form is X amount of commodity A equals Y amount of commodity B. Okay, this is the equivalent form of value. But this implies, obviously, it's reversible. If you say that X amount of commodity A is equivalent to Y amount of commodity B, you imply that Y amount of commodity B is also equivalent to X amount of commodity A. However, it's never just, because the commodity form is common to everything, every object that is exchanged under capitalism, no commodity is ever equivalent to one other commodity alone. Okay, so in other words, so the form of value of any commodity can be expanded into a total list of equivalent commodities. And this is what Marx calls the expanded or total form of value. So for instance, 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, but they're also worth 10 pounds of tea, 40 pounds of coffee, etc., etc. So in other words, the value of any single commodity can be expanded into the value of, the magnitude of all the other commodities with which this amount of this commodity is equivalent. Okay, so that's what Marx calls the total form of value. Okay, but finally, this total form of value, if for Marx, implies what he calls the general form of value. Okay, in other words, that there is, there must be, if for every commodity you can expand, the equivalence of any 2 commodities can be expanded into a total form of value, where you explain, where you list, the totality of equivalence for any single commodity, then this implies a general form of value, where you can specify what some general equivalent for every single commodity. Okay, so 1 coat is worth 20 yards of linen, 10 pounds of tea are worth 20 yards of linen, 40 pounds of coffee are worth 20 yards of linen, etc. But Marx's point is that the general form of value is, there must be something that expresses the general form of value. And in traditional societies, gold, for instance, is a general form of value. In order to exchange commodities, okay, the exchange relation implies equivalent value, total value, and ultimately a general form of value, which will be the general equivalent. Okay, and ultimately it's from this that the money form will be generated. So the claim is that in any kind of society organized around commodity exchange, there will be a general equivalent, okay, which expresses the general form of value. Gold was the general equivalent, the general form of value. So in other words, the value of every other commodity was expressible in terms of a quantity of gold. Okay, so gold then becomes the general equivalent, which expresses the general form of value. Value as such is measured in terms of gold. So Marx writes in number 18, through its equation with linen, the value of every commodity is now not only differentiated from its use value, but from all use values generally, and is by that very fact expressed as that which is common to all commodities. And by this form, commodities are for the first time really brought into relation with each other as values. The general equivalent is what relates every commodity to every other commodity as an exchangeable, as something that is valuable, that has a specific magnitude of value. Then he goes on in 19. In both cases, equivalent and general form of value, it is the private task, so to speak, of the individual commodity to give itself a form of value. But the general form of value, on the other hand, can only arise as a joint contribution of the whole world of commodities. A commodity only acquires a general expression of its value if, at the same time, all other commodities express their values in the same equivalent. And every newly emergent commodity must follow suit. It thus becomes evident that because the objectivity of commodities as values is the purely social existence of these things, it can only be expressed through the whole range of their social relations. So what Marx is doing here is the spectral objectivity of value. He says that value is objective, but it has a very peculiar objectivity, because it's not the objectivity of the objects, the properties and phenomena kind of described by natural science. It's an objectivity, once again, that is socially mediated, okay, that depends on the social totality. So his claim is that, in a way, this totality must already be, this totality of relations must be operative in order for any two commodities, A and B, to be exchangeable and to have something in common. So what he's saying is that the exchangeability of A and B presupposes the general equivalence, presupposes a general form of value, which is the gold standard, but ultimately money. Okay. So which is why Marx will say that money and commodities are the two forms of appearance of value. Okay, so value is this peculiar stuff. Okay, remember, it has no kind of physical or metaphysically neutral characteristics. It has this kind of this spectral objectivity, but it's this stuff that manifests itself first in the commodity form, where a commodity is something that is exchangeable. But what are commodities? What is it that renders commodities exchangeable? It's the money form. Okay, so in a way, so as soon as you have the commodity form, you must also have the money form. So what Marx is articulating here is the kind of how value, the commodity form presupposes value, but value presupposes money. However, value is the kind of in a way is what mediates, in a way is what finds expression in both commodities and money, which is why Marx says that commodities and money are the forms of appearance of value. Money is the immanent measure of value. We know that, so value has, we know that value abstracts from every qualitative particularity, and it can only be determined quantitatively, which is why value is, its only kind of feature is quantitative. There are magnitudes of value, but no qualities of value. So what can serve to kind of to measure magnitudes of value? Well, that must be some commodity in a way that represents the exchangeability of every other commodity. Okay, and so gold will be, when gold assumes the role of general equivalent, gold becomes a commodity in a way which expresses, in terms of which the value of every other commodity is measured. But what makes gold valuable? There's nothing intrinsically valuable. What makes gold valuable is human, a human social formation that decides that gold will be, the measure of value. And then finally, the point is that, at some point, the money we have, the money and the coins that are used in society are supposed to be placeholders for a quantity of gold. Remember, the gold in a way is supposed to be the kind of the ultimately valuable thing, the thing that measures the value of all other commodities. But because gold is cumbersome to kind of carry around in exchange, we create objects which are tokens or representatives of gold. So so paper money and coins are representatives of gold. But ultimately, once you have a kind of once the money form is has been instituted, and once money is kind of doing its work as a kind of the general equivalent, it turns out that you can decouple the value of the representatives of money as such, of what counts as money, from the privileged commodity which was taken to be its embodiment, gold. So in other words, so money becomes decoupled from gold, and this is, as Heinrich points out, this isn't. Although, for instance, in the 19th century, economists couldn't foresee this happening. It's entirely the logic of the money form is perfectly compatible with the decoupling of the general equivalent from any kind of privileged commodity. Okay, you don't need a gold standard in order to have for the general equivalent to play the social role that it plays. Okay, shall we have a quick break now? Because it's 6:33. Before the final section on the handout, shall we have a quick 5-minute break?
For me, it's okay.
Or does any or not? I mean, I'm happy to go on if people want to.
A break will be good.
Okay, we'll have a 5-minute break, and we'll come back just before. Just 5 minutes from now, basically.
Okay.
We're still on here?
I am on. Hello?
Hello?
Okay, is the 5 minutes break past?
Just about. I mean, I'm happy to start whenever anyone, yeah, shall we just give it like maybe, yeah, I think there's just kind of, yeah, we can start now, basically.
Okay, can you turn on your camera?
Sure, yes. Okay. Right. Okay, so I'll just try to finish the, what I want to discuss now is Marx's account of what he calls the fetishism of commodities. So we know, so for Marx, value then presupposes, the exchangeability of every commodity is mediated by a general equivalent, the money form. But the money form itself can't operate independently of value understood as a system of relations. The point about the value form for Marx is that it's the and we'll see this next week when we look at Marx's his kind of general formula for capital. Ultimately, the value form is what mediates every other kind of social relation under capitalism. So it has to be understood as a kind of, not simply as a kind of, it's not an object, nor is it any kind of substance. It's simply, it's a totality of relations. And it's this, now, when Marx talks about, remember we talked a couple of weeks ago, we said that, Marx, the young Marx distinguished between, the primacy between, appearance and reality, between, the reality of material production and reproduction, and its ideological misrepresentation. And remember, there's a famous kind of, metaphor of the camera obscura, in that the consciousness in a way, kind of inverts relations between, you know, the real material relations that condition social reality. Now, the opening of, you know, the first chapter of Capital is famous for this, you know, this analysis of the commodity form and the, you know, the articulation of commodity, you know, value and money. And now and Marx now brings in, he starts talking about what he calls the fetishism of commodities, and he describes the fetishism of commodities as an inversion of material relations and social relations. So what I'm suggesting is that the Marx's account of the fetishism of commodities is a mature consummation of ideological inversion, of the inversion relation between consciousness and material reality in the German ideology. So now, what is the fetishism of commodities? Fetishism is it's the transplantation of social relations between producers or laborers into social relations between the products of labor, or between commodities. Okay, so the fetishism of commodities characterizes this inversion where relations between producers of commodities, social relations between producers, are mediated and conditioned by social relations between the products of that productive activity, or which is to say between commodities. So Marx writes in number 20, whence then arises the enigmatical character of the product of labor as soon as it assumes the form of commodities. Clearly from this form itself, the equality of all sorts of human labor is expressed objectively by their products as all being equally valued. Now, here, remember, he means what is it? It's the equality of abstract labor is expressed objectively in the equality of value, okay, of commodities being equally exchangeable and having an exchange value. The measure of the expenditure of labor power by the duration of that expenditure, i.e. by socially necessary abstract labor time, takes the form of the quantity of value of the products of labor. Okay, what is the magnitude of value is a measure of socially necessary abstract labor time. And money is a measure of socially necessary abstract labor time. And then Marx continues, and finally, the mutual relations of the producers within which the social character of their labor affirms itself takes the form of a social relation between the products. Okay, now, what is it? If you think of what we just said about money, well, in what way is there a social relation between the products? Well, insofar as there's a general equivalent which relates commodities, every commodity to every other commodity. So commodities are socially related through the money form, which is the general equivalent. So, and then Marx continues, a commodity is therefore a mysterious thing simply because in it, the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor. Because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor is presented to them as a social relation, existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor. This is the reason why the products of labor become commodities, social things whose qualities are at the same time perceptible and imperceptible by the senses. So if we pause and if we think about this, the passage in bold here, So a commodity is mysterious, according to Marx, because in it, the social character of men's labor, which is to say that the fact that, commodities are products of human labor, okay? But the value of every commodity is determined by the socially necessary abstract labor time. But this value, the exchangeability of a commodity appears to us as an objective character. Okay, so in other words, any commodity, all the commodities surrounding us have an exchange value, have a worth, okay, which is, which we don't decide, which is objectively fixed. Okay, so every commodity has a value, and that value is, is fixed independently of the attitude of producers or consumers. Okay, so this is why the objective, value is a peculiar thing, because its value is objective, but it's an objectivity which is, in a way, is both generated through human social practice, but seems to operate independently of that practice at the same time. This is why it's spectral. Okay, it haunts kind of human social consciousness. And then Marx continues in after the semicolon, because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor is presented to them as a social relation, existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor. So what's the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor? Well, if you think about the kind of total value, every commodity is a product of labor. Okay, but every commodity has both an equivalent value and a total value. Okay, the total value is its value as expressed in relationship to the totality of commodities, every other kind of existing commodity. But commodities are produced by human labor. Okay, so in a way, the total value of any commodity is itself a social relation. Okay, it's a relation that a commodity has to every other commodity. Okay, and this is a social relation, but it's not a relationship between the producers of commodities, but rather between the commodities themselves. And finally, when you come to kind of money as general equivalent, insofar as the value of every commodity can be bought or sold, it has a kind of a monetary value, then once again, the value, the way in which money mediates between commodities or allows commodities to circulate, this is a kind of a social relation, but it's a social relation that seems to operate entirely independently of the laborers themselves. So Marx says, this is the reason why the products of labor become commodities, social things whose qualities are at the same time perceptible and imperceptible by the senses. So what Marx means here is that a commodity is a social entity, it's a social being, and it has certain qualities, it has a set of kind of useful characteristics. Commodities, we buy and sell commodities. We buy commodities because we need something. We want to use them for something. So their useful attributes are perceptible, but at the same time, their exchangeability, in a way, are what conditions this usefulness. The conditions under which a useful commodity was produced are invisible to us. They're imperceptible. Or more pointedly, if you think that the qualities of commodities that we desire, the perceptible features that we desire, are conditioned by imperceptible features, which are a function of the regime of commodity production and of the domination by value, by the value form. So think, and I think Marx means think about, who decides what commodities get produced. It's not we don't decide, because commodity, a regime of, commodity exchange isn't governed by the satisfaction of human needs, and human purposes. It's driven and determined by the logic of commodity exchange, to which the satisfaction of human needs is entirely incidental. This is why we buy shit we don't need. Okay, this is why we're always kind of consuming stuff without ever choosing whether or not we really, need or want this stuff. So this is why, a commodity is a social object whose qualities are both perceptible and imperceptible. But the fact that it's the imperceptible features of commodities that Marx is foregrounding here. But the point is that in order to grasp, the imperceptible features of these commodities, you need, in a way, to penetrate the veil of appearance, to see the reality behind the appearance. And to see this, you need these, the form determinations. You need to understand what a commodity is, what value is, and what money is, and how they are interrelated. And this is, and to perceive this, underlying reality, you need the resources of conceptual abstraction, because you cannot perceive it, through the senses. It doesn't manifest itself at the level of sensible experience. And this is why then he will say in number 21, he says, in the same way, the light from an object is perceived by us not as a subjective excitation of our optic nerve, but as the objective form of something outside the eye itself. But in the act of seeing, there is at all events an actual passage of light from one thing to another, from the external object to the eye. There's a physical relation between physical things. But it is different with commodities. There, the existence of the things qua commodities and the value relation between the products of labor, which stamps them as commodities, have absolutely no connection with their physical properties and with the material relations arising therefrom. There, it is a definite social relation between men that assumes, in their eyes, the fantastic form of a relation between things. Okay. And finally, so because I want to leave time for discussion, so I think I'm going to stop. Yes, I'm going to stop here with this. Yeah. So clearly, commodity fetishism for Marx, it has nothing to do, I mean, I hope this goes without saying, it has nothing to do with liking, certain kind of labels or certain kind of, certain types of objects. The fetishism of commodities involves transplanting. It's the condition under which social relations between the producers of commodities are transplanted into social relations between these commodities as products, but in a way which prevents the producers, the laborers, from seeing those genuine social relations. So in other words, the producers of commodities are prevented from perceiving the reality of their relationships to one another but also to the capitalists who own the means of production, because of the logic of, because of the relations between, because those relations appear as social relations between commodities themselves, which is to say that, you know, everything is, you know, everything, the way in which we understand ourselves necessarily assumes the form of relationship between exchangeable commodities, and that relationship is always mediated by money. So I think this is Marx's mature understanding of how the reality appearance distinction functions. It's not, so the way in which value, commodity, the commodity form, the value form, and the money form are the, underlie appearances in capitalism. It's not the way in which we think of, we can't understand them in terms of some kind of a world behind the scenes. This is not a metaphysical kind of, so to speak, a metaphysical paradigm. It's not a world behind the scenes in the sense that, criticized by Nietzsche, for instance. The point, the spectral objectivity of value is precisely something, it's a real abstraction. It's something in a way that is generated by human social practice, but then which, dominates and governs those practices and the ways in which we understand those practices. It's not kind of a linear relation. It's not, so the inversion in terms of the relationship between reality and appearance is not unidimensional. It doesn't just happen in a single dimension. It happens in several dimensions at once, and it happens in a way which in which we have to abstract from the concrete immediacy of our experience in order to be able to perceive the reality, the real abstractions that condition our existence and that underlie those appearances. Okay, I'll stop, and I think we should have a kind of a discussion now about some of these points.
Okay, I guess I'll start. I guess because this just ties into what we're talking about right now. What I'm wondering about this, when Marx leaves out ideal forms of value from this theory of fetishism of the commodity, which I believe you were just describing, I'm concerned that in doing that he's omitting like members, people under oppression, or members of the proletariat, laborers that don't fit into traditional forms of his historical period, like people who aren't actually making the commodities but contribute other forms of perhaps ideal value, and that they're omitted from this theory here, if that makes any sense.
Okay, now when you say, can you just say a little bit more? So you mean, well, first of all, not everyone. So Marx is talking about the relationship between labor and capital, between laborers, those who only have their labor power to sell, and those who own the means of production and who buy labor power in order to to produce commodities that they can sell to acquire more capital. So the first point would be, well, not everyone.
Right. I'm meaning in terms of say, maybe is this where a certain feminist critique of Marx would come in, because
yes, okay, like you mean like domestic reproductive labor and domestic labor, which
things
is not,
like this, and then also perhaps something where maybe you couldn't necessarily talk about the genealogy of morals, since you brought up Nietzsche, because it's like this master-slave morality doesn't apply here, because the relationship he's describing is between, you know, people who work in factory and the people who own the means of production. And is it that is because he's describing that relationship? Is that why he's leaving out these other forms of what we would call metaphysics now, but things that actually women would exchange on, like some kind of beauty or blah or something like that?
well, so Marx is talking about the, it turns out, as we'll see next week, when he begins, labor itself is also a commodity, and it's the commodity in a way that is necessary in order for what Marx calls the valorization process to be to continue. So in other words, capital needs labor to you know, to valorize itself, to create more of itself. But commodified labor is wage labor. Okay, so Marx is talking about the capital-labor relation is the wage relation. So in other words, that the labor that he's talking about here, the value, the labor that produces value, is wage labor. It's labor that is bought and sold. So yes, so like in one sense, unwaged labor. So you know, the feminist critique is to say, but look, in order for wage labor to be possible, in order for workers to be able to kind of to go out into the marketplace and sell their labor to capitalists, there has to be you know, there has to be kind of reproductive labor, and there has to be kind of effective labor, which is the which is the precondition for the availability of wage labor. But this labor is not you know, doesn't seem to enter into the wage relation. No, okay, so I think that's true, that's correct, and I mean there's a lot to say about this, though I think it complements Marx's account. I mean, you could say, I mean, the point for Marx is that, yes, I mean, and remember, Marx is not talking about, Marx doesn't think that value generating labor is good. He wants to abolish it, okay? So he's not, you know, the point, you know, and this is absolutely crucial, Marx isn't saying that this is, you know, all value comes from labor, but labor is not kind of, you know, properly acknowledged or remunerated, and therefore, you know, we need to have, you know, the value of labor needs to be kind of, you know, acknowledged independently of its, you know, independently of of exchange value as fixed by capital accumulation. He thinks that, you know, this kind of labor, the fact that we need to work to live, you know, the fact that we need to kind of to buy the things, to pay for the things that we need in order to keep existing, is terrible. So now that's the condition he wants to abolish. So even if you have a kind of a, if you think, so the domestic labor undertaken by women, when they care for children, who then, you know, and they care for the kind of the, you know, the male labor, in order so that, you know, he can go out and sell his labor on the marketplace the next day. Well, the point would be that kind of domestic labor it's not, in a way, it's ancillary to wage labor. So it's not itself wage labor, but in a way, the conditions of its existence are conditioned by wage labor. In other words, because the laborer needs to go out to buy, to make money in order to be able to pay the rent on the apartment and to buy the products to clothe and feed his family. Okay, and that relation, that's a relation that Marx also wants to abolish. Okay, so I think it's absolutely true to say that there's a necessary feminist corrective to this account of the relationship between labor and value, but the fact that in the effective labor that is undertaken in contemporary capitalist society is still conditioned by the wage relation and by value, even if it's only kind of ancillary to and doesn't directly enter into the wage relation, because the fact that women, the fact that these domestic arrangements are unavoidable is itself a consequence of domination, of the abstract domination of value. So the first thing to say would be that yes, this is a kind of a necessary corrective, but I don't think it doesn't kind of the indispensability of effective labor or domestic labor doesn't directly kind of refute Marx's account here. But I think you were saying something else. You were also saying that there's a kind of value. You were saying that there's a value that is generated.
Yes, but I think that you just sort of spoke to that point as well, because even in something like prostitution, which is a type of creating, interjecting into the exchange value economy that isn't domesticated, where there is money being. I think that also your point also speaks to a condition like that, because it's still based on this idea of value and exchange value. So
Marx's point is that there is no social relation that is untouched by value form, by the value form, and that is, and in a way that isn't kind of subsumed by the value form. So in a way, so that the relationships between human beings, between men and women, and all human relations are mediated and conditioned by value, even if they don't directly. And even so, for instance, I mean, the fact that so if you think about the distinction between work and leisure, that distinction itself is conditioned by value. Okay, the fact that and actually Marx says this really early on. This is why he wants to abolish. Communism for him is a condition under which work as we know is abolished, and therefore leisure, that the very distinction between work and leisure is abolished, because we don't need, because we're not forced to work in order to live. We don't need recreational time to be able to kind of to recuperate psychologically. So he envisaged a radical transformation in the nature of human social existence, and he thinks it will, and I think clearly, and I think as Marxist feminists have pointed out, so that even the relations between men and women would also be transformed with the abolition of property, class, commodity, etc., etc. So I don't want to kind of deny that there's lots of things. I mean, one thing I will say is that, and I think Heinrich is very good on this, in that, for instance, like if you think about Hart and Negger around the turn of the last millennium, there's a lot of talk about immaterial labor, And so as if this is something that kind of Marx doesn't take into account. But if you understand Marx's account of abstract labor, there's nothing material about labor for Marx. Okay, so for instance, a service, the example Heinrich gives is like a taxi ride. Okay, when you take a taxi, or any other kind of service, or if you pay for someone to, if you go and see a therapist, this is still this is still commodity exchange, and this is still labor. The difference is that the commodity is immediately consumed. Okay, when you pay for a taxi ride, the commodity that's being that you're paying for is the transportation, and the transportation is not a physical object. It's just something. It's something that happens. Okay, when you pay to see a therapist, the therapist listens to you, but that experience is still a commodity. It's something that you're paying for, and you're consuming it as you speak, as you talk about your problems to the therapist. So if you understand what Marx means by abstract labor, Marx doesn't think the distinction between the material and the immaterial vanishes. There's nothing material about abstract labor. So the really interesting in terms of the issue you just raised is like whether there is still nevertheless a distinction to be made between affective labor and other kinds of labor. Because look, if you have most nannies, domestic workers, okay, they carry out both practical, physical labor, but they also do undertake a lot of affective labor by looking after children, and often by becoming very attached to the children that they're looking after. So they are, but this is still labor in Marx's sense. They're still being paid, and this affective labor is, it's simply a modality. It's a species of abstract labor, but it's not some kind of new category. Okay, there's a couple of questions that have come up. First by Peter. So interesting to think with sex work, the body itself is the commodity as well as the labor, him or herself. So the tension between material and immaterial must sort of almost a pure instance of the problem. Well, in sex work, yes, it's a kind of the sex work, the body, but also a kind of a set of experiences, because think about a sex worker doesn't need to use his or her body to do their work. Okay, a sex worker can there's lots of things a sex worker can do that count as sex work that don't involve them using their bodies. So once again, I think the distinction between the abstract and the concrete here is not the distinction between the material and the immaterial. But yes, in a way, and also it's not clear to me actually.
I'm just trying to make the point that that the point of what you're saying is that, or what Marx is saying is that as I produce a commodity, it's then or as I'm looking at it, it's the labor and the social relations are sort of, it's external to me. Like the labor that I've put into it is the concept of alienation is that it's then sort of like presented as a relation between the commodities itself. So as sex work, you've almost kind of got this internal problem where I was just trying to comment on what the previous person was saying. Maybe you've got that relation sort of internally, whereby you or the things that you can do with your body are the commodity, as well as you're the laborer yourself. So that that tension exists sort of internally. It's not like the commodity. So your body is you, but it also is abstracted as a relation between commodities.
Yes, but then
like all the other bodies and practices that you can get out on the street, whatever.
Yeah, but Marx's point is that your mind can also be a commodity in this sense, and people sell their minds. So if you're working in advertising, you're effectively, and in fact, so the point, see, I think it's a mistake when people talk about sex workers, you know, selling themselves or selling their bodies. Actually, we all sell ourselves in that way. There's nothing different between a sex worker and any other wage labor in that regard, because remember, for Marx, what is the, it's labor power that is bought and sold. So everybody, a human being has a labor power that can have that involves physical, but also cognitive or psychological kind of manifestations, think of which is why it's a mistake to talk about. I think to talk about labor as involving more or less of the worker's body. Whether you turn up, whether you're in a factory or a brothel. It's the same kind of, you're selling part of yourself. You're selling your labor power as a commodity to the capitalist, in return for a wage. If you're working, and now in contemporary kind of society, people who work in, there's all sorts of, kind of cognitive labor, which is directly, it's our kind of our cognitive capacities, which are being directly kind of commodified. So we sell our cognitive skills and prowesses in exchange for a wage in order to produce more commodities. But it's at
the end of some. I guess the point I was making, at the end of some of those, you end up with a TV that is outside it's separate from you. Anyway, that's what I was trying to say. But you're absolutely right.
Okay.
The product of your labor is something outside of you. Whereas
yes, what is the commodity that you're producing is not something that's that you own, basically. That's the whole point about wage labor, is that you're producing something that you don't own, that you have no control over, and nor do you have any control of the conditions under which you produce this commodity, because they're determined by society. Okay, so there's a question here from Victor. So I'll read this out. Am I understanding you and Heinrich well in that replacing a labor theory of value with a monetary theory of value gets rid of a lot of the problems around the distinction between productive and unproductive work, or that between paid labor and reproductive labor? Under a labor theory of value, real value is produced by the human transformation of nature, and there's a lot of things that appear as worthless: immaterial labor, reproductive labor, etc. But under a monetary theory of value, there is no sense in which these things are less important or cannot be accounted for. The question is more about whether that labor is commodified, in that it is organized by the need to do it for money. Okay, so yes, the point about, so Heinrich insists that if you understand what Marx means by abstract labor, and how abstract labor is itself, socially, socially valorized, and in a way, socially valorized and measured, it has a kind of a monetary worth, then you realize that there's nothing that Marx thinks that's value. There's nothing concrete about value generating labor. The labor that enters into the wage relation to produce value is already abstract. Okay, it's already abstract, and the labor and you know, the concrete, you know, the example to think here is that in pre-capitalist societies, human beings, society is organized around stratifications. You know, there's a division of labor. There's a division of labor in which you know, certain people with certain skills make these things, and other people with other skills make these other things. Okay, but the skills are you know, the cultivation of these skills is, you know, is also kind of social in a way, so that the division of labor is also a social division in terms of you know, different members of societies. Okay, like think of the difference between kind of, you know, artisans and artisanal laborers and farm laborers, okay, or peasants. But the point that Marx is making is that under capitalism, capitalism and capitalist commodity production brings about a kind of a general kind of de-skilling, a decomposition of the kind of the segmentation of practical skill. Okay, so you can, if you're only able to make, you know, to do one kind of thing, that's not an asset in a capitalist economy, because the point is the point of commodity production is that you know, you get the decomposition. Capitalist production decomposes skilled labor into a set of, you know, elementary unskilled laborers. Think of assembly line production. Think about how a very complicated process is decomposed on an assembly line into a set of very, very kind of elementary processes that require no particular skill. Therefore, you can pay each individual laborer far less than you would have to pay a skilled laborer. Okay, so you reduce production costs in a way by decomposing, you know, kind of skillful, complex labor into a kind of you know, unskilled, into a set of kind of very you know, elementary steps that require no particular skills. And also, the laborers then, it means that, you know, laborers no longer have specific, you know, kind of things, it's types of work that are kind of reserved or allotted for them. You have to be able to do, to move from one kind of work to another kind of work. So you get an increasing homogenization of labor, where, you know, in a way, the more skilled you are at just doing one thing, the worse off you are in a commodity producing economy. So that's part of what you know, Marx is talking about. That's part of the kind of the you know, the phenomenon of abstract labor, of the abstraction from concrete labor. But this doesn't mean that, and the point is that this abstract labor, it has a monetary value. The only value that abstract labor has is monetary. Okay, it's value producing, but its value is measured in terms of the value of the commodities that it produces. So it has no intrinsic value. It's simply kind of, you know, it's either, you know, more or less well paid. So this doesn't mean that you dissolve the problem of distinction between productive and unproductive work. So this doesn't mean that you dissolve the distinction between wage labor and reproductive labor. It simply means that, in a way, what reproductive labor is useful, okay? Reproductive labor is useful. It's socially useful, and because it's it's necessary in order for there to be value-creating labor. If there's no reproductive labor, you don't have a population of workers who are able to kind of to sell their labor power to the capitalist. But that's its usefulness is not directly measured in terms of money. It's not directly monetizable, but it is still conditioned by money. Okay, because you wouldn't have to. Women wouldn't have to care, wouldn't be obliged to undertake this reproductive and effective labor if society wasn't, and if the existence of the family units wasn't subordinated to commodity production, and to if a family could live without having to work, then the things would be, women wouldn't need to undertake the types of reproductive and effective labor that they are obliged or forced to undertake in a society organized around commodity production. So, and then the second part of the question is, under labor theory of value, real value is produced by the human transformation of nature. Well, okay, the labor theory of value says that the value of a commodity is measured in terms of the amount of labor required to produce it. So, like, let's say kind of a horse saddle is more valuable than a glass, because it takes more labor to produce a horse saddle than a glass. But this is not Marx's theory at all, because for him, value is always already, labor is always already subsumed by value. The abstraction from concrete labor, or the abstraction of labor, has always already happened before you enter, and in a way it's a condition for you entering into the wage relation. So in other words, that there is no, the only value that is created by labor is exchange value, which is measured in monetary terms, which has a price, and the price of the price of that value is already operative when you sell your labor. Abstract labor has a price as well. So in this account, now this is the account this is Michael Heinrich's account, but it's the so-called value theory account, which is a product of a group of German kind of scholars who've been developing this new interpretation of, who developed this new interpretation of Marx, starting in the 1960s and continuing up till the present. So they insist on the primacy of value. They insist that labor is always already subsumed by value, and therefore labor doesn't. The value that is generated by labor is already conditioned or posited by value as such. And this is controversial for traditional Marxists who think that that labor in a way creates value, but also exists independently of value, and can somehow kind of assume ends and goals that would be kind of independent of value. And this value theories deny this, because they think that the labor that Marx is talking about, labor, value producing labor, is itself an abstraction that is conditioned by the valorization process and the capital relation. And therefore, it's a mistake to think that the standpoint of labor is in opposition to the standpoint of capital. The standpoint of labor is just capital's own standpoint upon itself, which is why the worker's perspective on capital is itself, a kind of, externalization of capital's self-relation, which is why, value theorists are notorious for the claim that the affirmation of labor cannot be the kind of, the sine qua non for the abolition of capital. It's labor, the abolition of capital requires the abolition of labor and of, wage labor, but also, labor as we know it, labor as even the forms of useful labor with which we are familiar are conditioned by valuable labor. And we cannot simply abstract from the capitalist totality and intuit forms of valuable labor that somehow transcend, our historical circumstances, the specific historical conditions of, capitalism. So this is why. A monetary theory of value, because really, money, remember, money is just the measure of value. There's no real difference between money and value. Money is just the form in which value appears to itself, and it's the way in which value measures itself. But there can be no money that is independent of the value form. And the point, so the final part of your question is that there's no sense in which these things are less important or cannot be accounted for. The question is more about whether that labor is commodified and is organized by the need to do it for money. Well, yes, labor power is bought and sold. Labor power is precisely that which enters into the wage relation. You buy and what you sell to the capitalist is your labor power, but your abstract labor power. And what you're selling is a commodity. And why do you need to sell it? Because you can't exist unless you can purchase other commodities. This is why you're compelled to sell your labor. I guess what I'm saying is that the distinction between material and immaterial labor, I think, is dissolved or becomes redundant once you understand, how abstract labor is already subsumed by value. That's the only point I'm trying to make here. The other point is about the relationship between, and then there are forms of useful labor that are, not directly value generating because they're not remunerated, they're not kind of paid. But I think it would be very difficult to insist that they are somehow not conditioned by the value form, according to this account, or that they somehow transcend the kind of, values, the self-reproduction of value. Okay, any other questions or clarifications?
Do you see, can I skip one more?
Sure.
You're talking a bit, sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat at the moment. You're talking a bit about the social relations being sort of like distributed in space and time. I didn't remember reading those terms in Kant. Is this kind of contextualizing it in the sort of German idealist tradition as a sort of, you know, are you talking about Marx's sort of difference to Kant here? As Kant, there's this sort of like isolated sort of subject perceiving these objects just in its head, if you like, through sort of transcendental sort of categories, whereas in Marx, the sort of that sort of same transcendental sort of realm is perceived as sort of distributed and social and constituted through sort of practices or something. Sort of like a resolution of, like, if you take Hegel as being kind of like, I don't know, maybe something in between Hegel and Kant, maybe, or I don't know, or something with a bit of, I don't know.
I mean, the key thing, you're absolutely right to emphasize, the key thing, I think, or, you know, in terms of relationship between kind of Kant and Marx, is that Marx, you know, also kind of, you know, rejects representation. So he thinks that, in a way, the, you know, if we, you know, the world as grasped from the vantage point of representation, or, you know, the world as represented and as, you know, experienced in terms of its representability, is not, you know, the real world, which is a world of practices. Okay, and the point, Marx's point about ideology and about, but also about commodity fetishism, is that practices are never transparent to their practitioners. This is why he keeps saying, you know, when he says what we do when we exchange commodities without understanding, without knowing what it is we're doing. We do it, but we do not know that we're doing it. And he also talks about the exchange abstraction operating behind the back of the practitioners. So for Marx, there's a dimension of practice, a dimension of the reality of practice operates behind the back of consciousness, of self-consciousness or awareness, and conditions it. And in terms of the account of real abstraction, so what he's saying, value is a real abstraction. Okay, value is a real abstraction. What does that mean? He thinks that it's something that is not, that has no tangible, perceptible form. It's not something that you can perceive with your senses. Neither, it's not something that you can point to or touch or grasp. But nevertheless, it is concrete in that it doesn't exist in our heads. It doesn't exist in our heads. It's not just a representation, but neither does it exist beyond space and time in some kind of transcendent metaphysical realm. This is what Marx means by spectral objectivity. He means an objectivity that is neither guaranteed by cognizing consciousness. If you think about, you know, the objects of representation in Kant, is it has a kind of it has an objectivity which is, intersubjectively guaranteed, because any cognizer, any knowing subject must be able to recognize it as having these characteristics. And this is, for Marx, the objectivity of value is not like that at all, because it's not something, it's not guaranteed through intersubjective consensus, nor is it constituted by our subjectivity. It's not constituted by our attitudes or beliefs or desires or anything else. It's constituted by what we do, by our practice. But the thing is that we don't understand, we don't know what it is we're doing when we exchange commodities. So the practice of commodity exchange generates the spectral objectivity of value, which then controls every other aspect, every other social relation, because every social relation is subordinated to value. And what does that mean? It means that there isn't anything that can't be bought or sold. There is no aspect of our existence that operates entirely independently of the commodity form. Okay? There is nothing in your life that you haven't paid for or bought in one way or another. That's what Marx is saying, by the spectrum. So in that sense, it's something very concrete, and it's concrete that it exists in space and time, but its existence, it's an object unlike any kind of discretely individuated empirical object. This is why it can't be directly perceived. This is why it can only be known, through an act of, cognitive abstraction. You need the detour of abstraction to be able to grasp what is really concrete, which is to say, the real abstractions of capital, commodity, value, money, etc., etc. And so what I'm suggesting is that, in a way, we usually think of the contrast between the abstract and the concrete. So the concrete is in space and time, and anything beyond space and time is abstract. But in a way, Marx, this is why he's so interesting, is that he's kind of undermining this familiar contrast and saying, no, there are things that are concrete, that exist in space and time, but they are not particular objects. And money is a case in point. Okay, money is not some kind of, money does not exist in a transcendent, a domain beyond space and time. So in that sense, it exists in space and time, and it's concrete, but it's not a particular thing. It can't be discretely localized at any spatial temporal point. And that's why it's an abstract. That's why it's a real abstraction. So value is a real abstraction in this sense, and money is just a kind of a form of appearance of value. And he says we are material beings in space and time. Money is a material phenomenon, but it's a phenomenon whose reality cannot be grasped at the level of empirical experience. This is why you can't understand money if you're an empiricist. Okay, if you think that money is generated by human beings coming into agreement about, well, we need a general equivalent, he says you'll never understand how money works, how money operates independently of the attitudes of its users. And he's not a rationalist either, because he thinks that, money can be, it's not an intellectual abstraction. It's not something that was designed to facilitate social interaction. Okay, and its machinations outstrip that which is, rationally transparent to us. So money has a logic of its own, which ends up kind of, to which we are subject, to which we are subjected, and to which our thinking is subjected. That's Marx's even more radical point, because it's not just, how we think and how we act is conditioned by value in capitalism. And this is something that he thinks that, you know, kind of traditional philosophy is simply lacks the conceptual resources to be able to understand this, to be able to understand the extraordinary weirdness of capital, of social reality, of the society that we have generated through our practices, but from which we are alienated because we don't understand what it is we're doing, and we don't have the cognitive resources to understand it unless we undertake this critical procedure which he's recommending. Yes, so this is, yeah, I mean, so when Marx talks about, you know, I mean, you know, writers, you know, a lot has been written about kind of, you know, the Gothic register of Marx's kind of some of Marx's terminology. You know, this talk about kind of, you know, when he talks about, you know, theological niceties required in order to understand the logic of the commodity and the spectral objectivity of value. Yes, weirdness in the sense that I think the best way to kind of, to grasp this weirdness is to say that for Marx, it's the intelligible, you know, what is transparent to consciousness, okay, is merely apparent, whereas what is, you know, what is materially real, what is sensible, what is spatio-temporally concrete, is precisely what is invisible to us. So it's as if this is this kind of inversion of the relationship between the intelligible and the sensible. We think that you have to, you know, traditional metaphysicians thought that you have to see through the sensible to grasp its intelligible structure. And Marx thinks that you have to see through the intelligible to grasp its sensible structure, but its sensible structure is precisely that of real abstractions. Sensible here means what is generated through concrete human practices, which are opaque to consciousness.
I have one more, but I can happily ask it like the next time or something if it's getting late.
Well, I don't mind answering it now. I mean, I have to go in 5 minutes, but I'll try and answer, you know, if possible.
You were talking about the kind of the end point of this process of kind of, or the ideal, if you like, of not having to labor, and in the sections that we were reading in the Grundrisse, I think that there was some sort of you know, there was like there was an idea of technological process accelerating to the point where everything got more efficient and everything was sort of done for you or something. I think that I read something like that in there. There was a lot about science and technology accelerating to the point, and this causing a kind of conflict in capital or something. I'm just curious. After the Grundrisse, in Capital on, is there anything else where Marx is talking about where this leads? I mean, I mean, I'm just trying to think of it in my head, because I'm kind of like, you know, there's kind of an assumption in, like, that if everything got more efficient, capital would go into some sort of crisis, and or you could accelerate it to the point where production was so efficient that nobody had to sell their labor and everyone was just provided for. But isn't it possible as well that, like, the human that you're presupposing in that just gets sort of transformed, and our minds get linked up to the company, and the new needs and wants are sort of created, like you want to live forever, you want to, you know, so that the whole process just keeps going infinitely.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm just thinking about the end point of this process of the, and maybe I've been reading up on these debates around accelerationism on the internet and whatnot.
Well, I think Marx. Okay, so for Marx, the motor of the entire what drives capitalism is what he calls the valorization process, through which surplus value is extracted from commodity production, and wage labor is necessary. Wage labor, or rather, living labor, is the source of surplus value. This is absolutely crucial for Marx's entire account. So the conversion of so capitalism, the fundamental formula for capitalism for Marx is money, commodity, money, prime. So in other words, you have an outlay of, there's an initial sum of capital, which is used to produce a commodity, which is then sold to generate a greater magnitude of money, okay, which is then reinvested in the production process, to produce more commodities and to create more money. So this is what he calls self-valorizing value. So this is what drives capitalist production, but this is also the condition of technological innovation for Marx, and it's a mistake. Now, Marx, in the Grundrisse, there's a famous kind of, the fragment on the machines, where Marx distinguishes between the tool and the machine. The tool is the instrument of labor. A tool is created to execute a specific function. Okay, so a tool has a specific purpose in the production of use value. A machine is something that is not reducible to a tool, because in a way, a machine, capitalism is ushers in this this regime of machinic production, where the laborers themselves become tools in the production process. They become components of the production process. But so like a factory is a machine that produces commodities, and the workers in the factory are merely machine parts. Okay, and there's no difference between the workers and the tools, the instruments that are used in the production process. But the organization of the factory and the existence of the factory is conditioned by the valorization process. So actually, it's a mistake, I think, Marx is not, for Marx, technological evolution is socially determined, and capitalism will only invest in technological innovation for the purposes of valorization. So technological innovation is subordinated to the valorization process, to the extraction of surplus value. But it's not, technological innovation is ancillary to capital accumulation. It's not, the capitalism only goal is self-accumulation. Okay, it just wants to create more money. It just wants greater and greater sums of capital. Technological innovation may or may not facilitate this process, but it's perfectly easy to imagine circumstances in which it does not. Okay, so I think those people so Marx is not an accelerationist. If acceleration is understood as the kind of the fusion of capital accumulation and technological innovation, where the two are, they have two different logics for Marx, and capitalism just cares about making more money, and if it can make more money without, technological innovation, it will be happy to do so. The second point is that the limit to technological, to the automation of production, of commodity production, is that labor is the ultimate source of surplus value, because it's without laborers to enter into the wage relation, there is no surplus value. So that the ultimate, the exhaustive automation of the production process would terminate the source of surplus value, the extraction of surplus value, and the process of capital accumulation, which is simply not, permissible. So in a way, if you understand the logic of Marx's account, you understand how there's an imminent limit to, the mechanization of labor, not because there's a qualitative distinction between what a machine can do and what a human can be. Most, even when Marx is writing, most human labor, can be automated and will be automated, but nevertheless, even in this automation, you have to kind of, what's striking is that, any automated process will still require some, human instruments or some human kind of machine parts as the source of surplus value. Because you don't have to pay a machine, and you can't extract surplus value from an instrument that you don't have to pay, for Marx. So this is why it's a mistake to think that, capitalism will kind of, capitalism does not have a kind of a progressive evolutionary teleology.
But isn't that the problem? Because if you could automate everything theoretically, then you would not be able to extract that surplus.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. And the other problem is that, the problem is that the social existence, you have to focus on, the forms of it, because every social relation is ultimately mediated by the commodity form and by value. What human beings, how human beings exist, is entirely subordinated to the logic of capital accumulation. And it seems, I think it seems foolish to think that that would be, it seems that could somehow be, that would ever, leave human beings free to kind of, to do things that are, that will, impede or contravene this logic. So I think that the claim that, everything will become automated and then human beings will be free to kind of, to do whatever they want to do, that's clearly not going to happen, because, a kind of a society organized around commodity production has certain necessary features, private property, class stratification, and the existence of a state, and even, I think these these free markets kind of ideologues who say that capitalism, that the state is an impediment to the evolution of capitalism, I think that's a metaphysical fantasy. I think the state form is, spontaneously generated by capital. And it's true that the state, but the state is a useful instrument of capital. It's not a kind of something that capitalism is, necessarily compelled to dissolve. I mean, that's a longer debate to have, but that's also why I don't accept these kind of claims that capitalism will just kind of destroy every kind of social impediment and plunge into the wild blue yonder.
That was a really good answer. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, so I do have to go, I'm afraid. So okay, thanks very much. And next week we'll do we'll talk about we'll carry on where we left off. We'll talk about the rest of chapter 1, and I think the reading is on the syllabus as let me see, it's pages, Capital Volume 1, but pages 482 to 525. It's what was the reading for week 5 on the original handout, the original syllabus. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Ray.
Thanks.